I actually didn't have the education courses, so I was on an emergency certificate, it was called. And I went back to graduate school and took a couple of courses in education and said, I don't think this is going to work out for me.
There it is.
Two separate stories. Which one is right? Was Elizabeth Warren, quote unquote, visibly prego, at which point they didn't invite her back? Or was it a situation where Elizabeth Warren just decided not to go back because she wanted to pursue a different education? This is kind of the problem. She has a pattern of dishonesty, and this pattern of dishonesty allows, at the very least, me to be somewhat distrustful of stories that she put out when there's contradictory evidence. I mean, she said she was Native American for God knows how long, and she teeter-tottered between being white and Native American. I would strongly argue she thought she was going to get some advantage from it. Harvard was touting her as being a Native American, and she told them that she was Native American, where beforehand she said that wasn't the case. She said her parents eloped because there was this kind of fight about her parents, about one of her parents being Native American. That ended up not being true. You can see the thing in the newspaper. She has a pattern of dishonesty that, I'm sorry, is somewhat disturbing. And this story is just the latest video of Warren saying one thing with having a history of, or at the very least, evidence showing something else. One caveat. The evidence in this very specific case cuts two ways. And I want to talk about it. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content and you find yourself coming back often, please like, share, and subscribe. You can always support through PayPal or Patreon. I say that on every video, not because I love it. It's just this content is brought to you by you. YouTube demonetizes these videos pretty much constantly. This story has actually been getting a bit of traction. Elizabeth Warren has been saying on the campaign trail that she was fired for being visibly prego from a job that she absolutely and entirely loved. The problem is, when you look at the documentation back in the records, the resignation of Mrs. Warren's speech is effective June 1971 was accepted with regret. Also, you found that she was welcomed back for a second year. Meaning, they actually offered her a second term. She turned it down. On the campaign stump, however, again, she's saying this.
So my first teaching position was as a special needs teacher. There we go. I loved that job. But by the end of the first school year, I was quite visibly pregnant, and the principal didn't invite me back for the next.
The principal didn't invite me back. Now, again, according to her, she was visibly pregnant and she wasn't invited back. The problem is that the documentation kind of points to something where that's not necessarily true. These newly released documents suggest that Warren was never fired at all. Rather, they support the idea that Warren simply quit her job as a public school teacher in order to attend law school. And that is literally meaning the documentation lines up with what Warren said in this interview.
It was in a public school system, but I worked with the children with disabilities. And I did that for a year. And then that summer, I actually didn't have the education courses, so I was on an emergency certificate, it was called. And I went back to graduate school and took a couple of courses in education and said, I don't think this is going to work out for me.
She said, I don't think this is going to work out for me. She didn't say anything about being fired because she was, quote unquote, visibly prego in this interview. Warren has been crafting a story around herself, and I'm sorry, she seems to have a pattern of dishonesty that has tracked her throughout her career. She was not of a Native American. Her parents didn't elope. And in this particular situation, it seems like she wasn't fired for being visibly pregnant. They offered her the job back and she turned it down. And it seems she turned it down because she wanted to pursue law school. And again, this is not me making this up. The documents are right here. You can look at them for yourself. These are the minutes associated with what Warren is talking about, meaning the resignation of Mrs. Warren's speech was accepted with regret. They offered her a second term. Now, there's a catch, and there's a caveat. Warren is standing by this story. And Warren is not just standing by this story. NBC News, or CBS, said a teacher who taught with Warren the same year at the exact same school couldn't corroborate Warren's exact circumstance, but could confirm that they would fire teachers for being visibly pregnant. Meaning, I don't know what was going on from the standpoint of Elizabeth Warren. However, there did seem to be, or there was a culture there of doing that. There's also further cooperation on this point. Pregnancy policy on teachers voided. Pregnant teachers can no longer be automatically forced out of New Jersey classrooms. So this thing is saying a few years after Warren left the school, this particular policy was voided. Problem. Warren, despite this showing up, just because that might have been a policy, that doesn't necessarily mean that it applied to Warren. Yes, it might have been a policy that Warren knew about, but again, Warren is saying two different things here, which is kind of the problem. She's saying she was forced out for being visibly pregnant. She may have been perfectly aware that there was a policy of forcing people out for being visibly pregnant. Doesn't necessarily mean that policy applied to her in that particular moment. And again, she's saying two different things here. So the issue and the discrepancy is not entirely one of people just picking. It's in part because Warren said one thing here, said something else earlier, and the documents back up what she said earlier, not what she is saying here. Once again, don't mean to beat it into the ground.
So my first teaching position was as a special needs teacher. There we go. I loved that job. But by the end of the first school year, I was quite visibly pregnant, and the principal didn't invite me back for the next school year.
It was in a public school system, but I worked with the children with disabilities. And I did that for a year. And then that summer, I actually didn't have the education courses. So I was on an emergency certificate, it was called. And I went back to graduate school and took a couple of courses in education and said, I don't think this is going to work out for me.
She made a choice. She didn't say anything about being forced out. And when you go, again, back to the records the records say something else. Warren wasn't kicked out. So right here. Right here. All right, Warren claims she was fired from her public school job because of pregnancy discrimination. But according to the minutes from Riverdale, Warren resigned and school officials didn't want her to go. Another item describes the mood when Warren hung it up. And these documents cast doubt on another permutation of Warren's by now ever-evolving public teaching story. A feature of her campaign stump speech, an integral aspect of her personal biography Warren is now selling would be Democratic primary voters. Warren, they didn't want her to go. They didn't want her to go. Now here's the thing. It is impossible for me to know which of these stories that Warren is pushing is true. The problem is that the stories diverge from one another. The documentation says one thing. Warren backs up the documentation in her prior interviews, but now, in 2019, she has a different stump speech. I don't know which one is true. And I know some Warren supporters might say this is nitpicking. I don't think this is nitpicking at all. What do you know of your candidate? Think about what we're saying here. We're talking about choosing a person who's going to be president of the United States. What do you know of your candidate? And how do you know it? Meaning, understand you may like Warren and all, but what are you using to evaluate this particular person, if not the things that this person is saying, and whether or not that person has a track record of honesty? And if they don't have a track record of honesty, how can you trust them with this other stuff? Meaning, if my point is accurate and my point is valid, meaning there are various points that Warren has crafted a story around herself that has not necessarily been true. And this has been through various points of her life. And I point out aspects of her campaign that doesn't quite make sense, meaning the not taking money in the primary, but taking it in the general election. The logic of it doesn't even follow. And I'm trying to point out that if you can't trust her in these items, why do you automatically trust her in the other items? The dishonesty in this respects casts a dark shadow on any notion that she is going to be pushing for the stuff that she's talking about pushing, that she is also, just like apparently her history, she's evolved on. It matters. What you have, what the person says, what that person is, the things that person lies about, the things that person tells the truth about. Those things matter. Those things matter. You have nothing else to evaluate your person. Nothing else other than what that person has done. You can't peer into the soul of Elizabeth Warren. You can only look at the outskirts. She's just like anyone else. You can only look at what that person does, what that person says. And in Elizabeth Warren's case, she has a pattern of dishonesty. I accept that there is a caveat that may lend some credence to the story. The problem is that Elizabeth Warren herself has given two different accounts, with the earlier account lining up with the records. So, before you look at me and say, oh, dude, you're a pick. I'm sorry, this is not nitpicking. This is what vetting looks like. I want to know if my candidate is telling the truth. I want to know if my candidate is lying. And if you are supporting Warren, I don't understand why you wouldn't want to know whether or not she's telling the truth. If she has a pattern of dishonesty on items surrounding her, which she does, I'm sorry. The woman called herself a Native American. The woman, she's white at some points, Native American at others. The moment that she became a tenured professor at Harvard, she was white. After that, she was white. And now you have this. My only point is that it seems like Warren's trying to craft a narrative around herself. And I would think that it is imperative to know whether or not it is true. And in one case after the next, it doesn't seem all that much to be true. This is just the latest of several items. Again, her family didn't elope. This is just another of several items. And yes, again, I give the caveat that there was a culture of it, but it doesn't necessarily mean, just because there was a culture of it, that Warren herself was subject to it, if that makes sense. It's like, yes, the culture of it was there, but whether Warren is subject to it or not was a second question. It doesn't necessarily mean just because one existed that she was subject to it. I hope you understand what I mean. There's a difference in those things. And again, based on what Warren was saying essentially was following up what the documentation says. I'm not the bad guy for bringing this up. This is just what vetting looks like. Like, share, subscribe. Minor talk. Did she say she was fired, or did she say she resigned? What a person says and what a person actually does are two different things. That is true. Warren says she was pushed out. In one case, in 2019, she said she was pushed out. In 2007, she said she left in order to pursue education. And again, The video is here for you to see for yourself. She's been saying it on the campaign stump a few times.
So my first teaching position was as a special needs teacher. There we go. I loved that job. But by the end of the first school year, I was quite visibly pregnant, and the principal didn't invite me back.
It was in a public school system, but I worked with the children with disabilities. And I did that for a year. And then that summer, I actually didn't have the education courses, so I was on an emergency certificate, it was called. And I went back to graduate school and took a couple of courses in education and said, I don't think this is going to work out for me.
There it is, plain as day.
Those are two very different accounts. Just so we're clear, those are two very different accounts. I was visibly pregnant. They didn't offer me my job back. Her second point is, no, I decided to pursue higher education. And based on the minutes from the board meeting, well, that backs up the earlier claim that she made. According to the minutes of April 21st, 1971, Riverdale Board of Education meeting obtained by the conservative-leaning Washington Free Beacon, Warren was unanimously offered her job back. Motion carried by unanimous vote. According to a different set of minutes from the same board one year before the second term was substantially similar to the terms for the first teaching. Meaning, yes, there might have been some people there who were pushed out for they were visibly pregnant. It seems that Warren was offered her job back. That seems to go against what Warren is saying here, that she was not welcomed back because she was visibly prego. And it also seems to bolster what the earlier Warren was saying, that she decided to pursue teaching. Education. Donald Smead, if she wins, this pattern of dishonesty is a major weakness when they get to past the primaries. Trump may not be the Republican challenger. Well, there are two things, right? If Trump is the Republican challenger, or if he's not, it's hard to hit Trump with lying, even if you can show that there's a pattern of dishonesty in your candidate. And if they are going to scream this to high heaven with billions of dollars, nobody in the Democratic primary is going to challenge Warren on this stuff. In the Republican general election, they would have $1 billion, if not more, in order to hit Warren with all sorts of smears and everything else. And this pattern of dishonesty will be a problem. I'm sorry. Honestly, I think it's a problem now. Hard to beat fake Trump with yet another fake candidate, Ryan for Prez. It's just weird. I don't know, I don't trust her because of a lot of this stuff. Her argument is, I didn't get anything out of claiming to be a Native American. Whether you got something out of it or not is irrelevant to what you thought you were going to get out of it. I strongly suspect she thought she was going to get something out of it. I mean, after all, she signed that she put that she was a Native American on a bar license. She told Harvard she was a Native American, even though initially she said she don't know where, Harvard didn't necessarily, she pretended as if Harvard figuring out she was a Native American was just this kind of magical process. And then later on she admitted, yes, I told them that I was a Native American. I'm sorry, she has a pattern of dishonesty. Her parents didn't elope. And for people to say this is not that big of a deal, I'm sorry, it is a major deal. It is a major deal. I still put to you that what you know of the person who you are voting for is essentially all you have to evaluate them on is what they've done, who they are. At the very least, the things that they've said over the course of their career. And you look at that and you compare it to the other candidates that are in the race, or even your own value set on whether or not you want to support somebody because there may be red lines within the process. If the only people who were running were Republicans, at that point, you're probably not going to vote. You can give her a pass. But at the very least, be honest that she seems to have a pattern of dishonesty. And trying to code over it, this is not a real story. I'm sorry, it's a real story. You might say that, well, look, there's a chance where she was being truthful. Fair enough. I give you the benefit of the doubt in saying there's a chance of it. I'm just saying this story also looks dodgy, and it seems like the earlier version of Elizabeth Warren is contradicting this current version of Elizabeth Warren, who wants to craft her campaign around this I'm a woman candidate. And I know what it's like to be a woman raising a kid. Fair enough. But let's just be very honest also. If I can't say as a flat fact this story is legit, you can't say as a flat fact that it's not. And you have a lot of people out there who are pushing for Warren, who are pretending as if, the story has been debunked somehow because of a policy that they had back then. The problem is Warren is saying something different. She's saying something different. She's saying two different things. I wasn't hired back because I was visibly prego, and you look at the records, she was, and you look at her previous testimony, and it was, I decided to leave to pursue things. This wasn't going to work. She's saying two different things. Pow wow chow. And there's that, which is disturbing. All right. I want to move on. Like, share, subscribe. Look, politicians. I've said this with Obama. I've said this with all of them. They use whatever attribute they have at their disposal. Doesn't matter what it is. Whether you're a woman, whether you're white, black, straight, gay, etc. Whatever they have at their disposal, they can try to get a constituency. They would use that. If it's femininity, if it's I'm a African American and so I know what it is for the black struggle, so I'm going to give a speech on that stuff. Class is the thing that matters more. I don't doubt that any particular group faces some issues in trying to push their way in life. So I don't doubt that Elizabeth Warren might have had difficulties through her life for being maybe a mom and those type of things. It just seems like this particular story may not be true, even though for women across the country, it may be. It just seems like she's trying to appropriate a story to wrap herself in a certain image of herself in order to kind of get constituencies and endear herself that much more to a certain demographic of the electorate. That's what it comes across as. That's why the story matters. It just seems in one case after another, she's becoming something that she wasn't. Like, share, subscribe. I still ask the question, if Elizabeth Warren had a black relative, would Elizabeth Warren be calling herself a black woman? If that answer is no, why does she identify with being a Native American? Like and share.